Hey guys, Mr. P here,
Hey, it's Mr. Schmitz.
and in this video we're going to talk about how populations grow. So when describing populations, there are a variety of things we need to consider, like geographic range, growth rate, density and distribution, and age structure.
We're going to get into these a little bit in more detail here in just a second. All of these are different ways that ecologists can quantify and better understand populations that we are observing. So if you expand on geographic range a little bit, this is the size and area that a population exists within. So as you can see on the map, this is the mosquito's habitat currently, at least in 2019, and then a projected change based on climate change that we are seeing expanding the range that mosquitoes can live in. Now, range can be global, as shown here. It can be a very narrow range if you're looking at the range of the population of gut bacteria in your own microbiome. That's a very small range, limited to your intestines and stomach. It could be a single tree stump in a forest for a species of fungi. So range can be any different size, but specifically the geographic range is looking at just the size and area that a population exists within. That's one way that we can understand a population.
And you bring up good points about the particular size of the range based on migration patterns and stuff. Some organisms, fun fact for you, some organisms like wolves and monarch butterflies have relatively large geographic ranges, while some live literally within like 1 square meter their entire life.
Wow.
Right? Question for you. Do humans impact geographic range?
I think absolutely. Humans definitely impact geographic range. I think that can be exhibited actually in the map that we're showing here still. Humans have altered our climate and continue to alter our climate. And as you can see, that's resulting in the mosquitoes having a larger range. Other ways that humans could impact range is through things like building cities, farming. All of those human activities where we're changing the land use impact the species on it and can therefore impact the range that those species live within.
Yeah, and I know that certain species, due to like deforestation, like the Bengal tiger, is decreasing pretty rapidly.
Absolutely. A lot of those top food chain predators that we talked about last unit are running out of range and having a harder time finding food because we are changing their habitats fairly dramatically.
Yeah. Last fun fact related to geographic range. Did you know that there is a shrimp or a krill-like creature that has the largest geographic range on the planet?
I had no idea. What is its range?
I don't know, but I do know that it inhabits basically all of the global oceans on the planet.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. So now looking at growth rate, this is a predator-prey graph or a predator-prey interaction. Obviously you can see if you look at the two axes, there is a time component and there is a population size. So they are pretty much directly correlated. If you have a prey item population increase, then naturally the predator population will increase as well. If a predator population increases, then typically they're eating more food, and so therefore it will interact the prey population to decrease, and so they will both fluctuate. Typically though, you want to always kind of key in on the fact that the predator population will actually peak slightly beyond when the prey population increases.
So in understanding growth rate a little bit, we're obviously showing one example here. The growth rate, depending on the species, can vary dramatically. Some species can grow very, very rapidly and can double their population very, very often, and we'll talk about what kind of shapes of growth curves that can show us. And some populations take a long time to reproduce and have very slow growth rates.
Yeah, organisms that have really long gestation periods are going to typically grow really slowly, and organisms that have short gestation periods will grow really quickly.
What's an example of something with a really long gestation period, maybe?
Well, I know humans have a 9-month gestation period, but organisms like elephants have, I think, over 2 years. I think it's like a 24 to 26-month gestation period, which is incredibly long.
So that means the elephant population is going to be growing very slowly.
Yep. And organisms like bacteria can double every 20 minutes. So
wow.
That is a kind of stark contrast.
Right, a very dramatic range of growth rates.
Yeah. Focusing on density and distribution, there are three ways that populations typically space themselves out. There's a random population distribution, there is a uniform population distribution, and there's a clumped population distribution. When might these be advantageous?
Yeah, so when looking at our distributions, these provide advantages for all types of species depending on which type of distribution that they have. For example, the clumped distribution is where species work in close groups with one another. The example here is fish swimming in schools. This is obviously an advantage because they can move together and find food together, as well as provide a little bit of safety from their predators.
Another example would be wolves working in packs, usually to acquire food.
Absolutely, yes. Working in a clumped group helps them track and hunt their prey very effectively. A couple of other distribution types, obviously random. Random would be a group that is spaced out seemingly at random or unevenly. This is a lot of times due to the distribution of their seedlings. So a lot of times plants are randomly distributed due to factors like wind and birds and insects carrying seeds and pollen, which will result in an unpredictable pattern of those.
And I know that the unevenness of the terrain or topography can result in kind of an uneven random distribution as well.
Absolutely. As far as uniform goes, it's fairly straightforward. These are organisms that are evenly spaced out. Another example of this would be kind of how humans have farmed. Even think of apple orchards or rows of corn. Those would be uniform distribution. Are there any other examples in nature that you've got?
I know that there are plants in deserts, and I can't remember what the exact name of the plant is, but they use the uniform distribution as a way to decrease competition. Obviously, in a desert, there is very low water and low hydration levels within the soil. It's a lot of sand, and so by spacing themselves out uniformly, it decreases competition between them, and they can kind of all benefit from the lack of resources that there are.
Quite a beneficial strategy. Last question here before we move on is, how are humans distributed?
I think humans are distributed, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but are very clumped around resources, specifically water. If you were to look at the distribution of humans on the planet, we are not uniformly or randomly spread out or dispersed across the planet. I think we're very clumped around natural resources.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. Humans found resources and have accessed resources for a long time, and so we built our civilizations clumped in those places with the most resources. Obviously, in today's global world, we have the ability to transport a lot of things. However, we have not changed the locations of our communities and our cities, so we are still very much clumped to this day.
Right. And within these clumps, there's a larger distribution and a larger density than there are, obviously, in the random and uniform.
Very good. The last way that we look at and describe populations is through something called age structure. The age structure diagram gives us an idea of how the population will grow in the future or maybe decline in the future based on the distribution of males and females in a population at various age groups.
And so in this graph, you can see that there is half. So right down the middle, there's a stark contrast between the two colors. In this case, if we look at the legend, males are blue and females are pink. And so the males would be on this left side and females would be on this right side. Some things you can gain or glean from this is we look at percentage of population on the X, we look at age on the Y, and so as individuals increase in age, they're moving up this graph. Obviously, the graphs are typically tapered towards the top. As organisms age, the population of that particular age band will decrease just naturally due to death. But you can see that it's typically 50-50 or evenly split between males and females all the way through every age band.
And what we're trying to learn from this is how quickly will a group grow. And we can learn that by looking at the bands at the bottom half, which we would call our reproductive years. So sort of the 15 through 45 to 50 range we would kind of classify as reproductive years, but also underneath that we would call pre-reproductive years, which is going to be the population soon entering their reproductive years. And what this tells us as a population is how many offspring will this population be having in the next 5, 10 to 15 years? And that will tell us, is this population growing quickly, is it growing slowly, or even is it going to be decreasing in the future like some countries are that have a much higher distribution of old or elderly individuals compared to their young individuals.
Yeah, and you can use, this is obviously a U.S. Human population pyramid, but you can use these population graphs for a variety of species. Looking at the age structure of a particular organism can help gain some insight into the overall health of that population, and looking at the long-term logistics of that population over time. And while we look at these human population pyramids, there is another interesting fact that I would like to throw in there, that there is a jellyfish species that is considered biologically immortal since it can revert to its juvenile form after reaching adulthood. Obviously, it complicates age structure maps because you have adult jellyfish that can revert back to juvenile form, and so they are essentially biological immortal, which means they don't really fit into any of those bands.
That's got to make it tough for ecologists to make these pyramids.
Can you imagine trying to figure out what the age of a jellyfish is and where it should be on an age band if you don't know where it's at biologically?
Well, it's a good thing that we have other ways to describe populations besides age structure.
Right, and so that solidifies in our mind why we need all four ways to describe populations.
So now that we understand how ecologists describe populations, let's take a look at actual population growth. We won't dwell on this too long, but there are 4 ways that a population can actually physically change its number. They're all shown up here. Mr. Pfeiffer?
There are 2 ways in which a population can increase. So on the left side of this, you see the arrows coming into our population. This, obviously, in the middle is our fish population. And the first way is with birth. So fish physically hatching from their eggs, and immigration with an I, that is fish coming into a particular population. I like to think of immigration with the I with the into association.
That seems like a vocab word.
Right? Immigration. So birth rate increasing. If we have more births than we have death rate, then obviously population will increase. And then immigration with an I, that's fish coming into or organisms coming into our population. That leads to a population increase. While death, which is the opposite of birth, fish dying, obviously decreasing the fish population, and emigration or immigration with an E, I like to associate that with exit, which means that is population, or that is a group of individuals leaving a particular population. Both immigration and death rate will decrease population. So overall, if you have a birth rate or an immigration number that is exceeding your immigration and death rate, your overall net change for your population will be positive. And then the inverse happens if your immigration or organisms exiting your population and death, if that exceeds the birth rate and the immigration into, then overall your net change will be negative.
Absolutely. And so these are the only 4 ways that a population can change. We will talk later this chapter about all the different ways that birth and death rate and immigration are affected by other factors, but when it comes down to the actual numbers, these are the 4 ways that a population actually changes.
Yeah, and is this 100% natural? No. There are human impacts that obviously can impact birth rate and death rate. There are human impacts that can impact immigration and immigration, and so like you said, there are a variety of factors, but just looking at the numbers, if your organisms being brought into a population exceed the organisms that are leaving or dying, then your population will grow, which is the goal for any species.
Absolutely. So in looking at population growth, we're going to look at 2 types of growth curves, which we will actually be able to show on a graph, and you'll see here. The first one being exponential growth.
Exponential growth happens when a population is basically subjected to unlimited resources and are unchecked in their population, meaning they just continue to reproduce at a really quick rate. Now we talked, there are bacteria. In this case, this particular genus and species will reproduce every 20 minutes. E. coli will reproduce every 30 minutes, and this particular species will reproduce every 40 minutes. And the only reason we show you this is that you can see that even though 20, 30, and 40-minute reproduction rates, respectively, are really quick, you can see how drastic the population change over time is when you're looking at a total of 120 minutes. The blue line, obviously more indicative of the actual exponential curve, but these red and green, if you were able to extend this minute axis out for another 120 or another 200 minutes, these would experience exponential growth as well.
Right, so the exponential growth is that J-shaped curve that you see, and it is indicative of, like you said, when we have sort of that perfect environment. So a lot of times this is right after a species has moved into or inhabiting a new area. When we first move in somewhere and we have all the resources, we haven't run out of anything yet, there's not much competition yet, and this allows the species to grow very, very, very rapidly.
And this reminds me of a case study of an invasive species you probably heard of, the cane toad in Australia, has been exponentially growing, or the population of the cane toad has been exponentially growing for, I don't know, a decade?
It's probably more than that now. Do you actually know why they brought cane toads in?
I don't.
So they're cane toads. They were used to control insects in the growth of sugarcane in some Asian islands, and Australia saw that and had sugarcane growing in parts of their country. And so they brought in the cane toad as a control measure. And actually what happened is they accidentally introduced an invasive species in the cane toad, unintentionally trying to solve a problem that they had, and it resulted in now we have millions of cane toads invading all of Australia.
And so because it's an invasive species and it's not supposed to be there, it didn't really have a role within the ecosystem that it was brought into, and so there are no predators?
Correct.
And so it's basically growing unchecked, no predators, unlimited food supply. And what is that doing to other natural species?
It is dramatically impacting the ecosystems in Australia. And for those of you thinking toads shouldn't be such a big deal, we're talking about dinner plate sized toads. These are massive toads. This is a dramatic shift in an ecosystem to introduce millions of dinner plate sized toads.
That is horrifying.
Yes. Check them out online.
That's huge.
Yes.
And every population, after experiencing a exponential growth, will eventually get to a point in their particular ecosystem where resources become somewhat limited. Every ecosystem cannot support unlimited numbers of organisms, and so there is kind of what we call a set number or a plateau that a particular environment can support just based on the amount of space, based on the amount of water, based on the amount of shelter, based on the amount of predators, based on the amount of prey, based on the amount of nutrients, minerals.
Also, things like the spread of disease. As you get more organisms, disease and other factors will affect these populations as well. And so what this leads to is something that we call logistic growth. And you can see that in this diagram here. Logistic growth is characterized by three phases. The first one being that period of exponential growth where we have that rapid growth. Eventually, those factors that we just mentioned start piling up, and that causes the growth to slow down, where we finally reach the stopping of growth or the leveling off, creating what we would call an S-shaped curve. And it's going to stabilize at what we call carrying capacity. And that's that number that we were just talking about, which defines the highest number that an ecosystem can support of any particular population.
I know that there's kind of two lines on this particular graph. You have kind of this trend line, and then you have this kind of gray line, and it gets really jaggedy at the top. What is that about?
So basically what happens is these species in these populations aren't able to come together and talk about and say, hey, we're at the top of our population, we need to slow down our reproduction rate. Species are living, they're dying, they're reproducing, and they're eating, and so what happens is we shoot up above our carrying capacity, which means that we don't have enough resources, which causes little, we call them diebacks, where some of the population dies because they run out of resources, and so they shoot above and then they drop below, and then because they're below they can support a few more, so then the population grows a little bit and shoots back above, and then because they shot above we run out of resources and it goes back down below. And so you see this continual sort of zigzag, or even a wave if you graph it in that way, but sort of a waffling back and forth right around the carrying capacity, which will sort of result in that continual change.
Cool. And you brought up a good point. Organisms on the planet don't have summits, and they don't come together and look at data and look at all of the resources that they have, and resource partitioning and all the things that are required to kind of identify and understand the population dynamics. However, humans have actually been able to change their carrying capacity over time. And would you say that human carrying capacity has increased or decreased over the last 100 years?
I think it's pretty safe to say that human carrying capacity has increased, and that's due largely in part to things like our medicine, agriculture, technology advancements. All of these things we have that other species don't have, so we have been able to, humans are a very unique species. We have been able to arguably shift our carrying capacity more than any other species in the history of species on Earth.
That'll be it for this video. I think that was a banger.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us.
Subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time.